Matthew, welcome to the Nifty Travel Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex, for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. And well, the first thing I always like to ask my guests is what about your earliest memories of travel?
Earliest memories for me, I grew up, next to a railway line, my entire life. So it's sort of, being a toddler, doing those, little travels around, the North Shore of Sydney. So that's, being that short on the old S sets, when they used to be common all around here. Anybody from Sydney would remember those.
Yeah, well, it's certainly within your blood very early then.
Yeah.
And having had a look around your social media channels, you have a very broad range of interests. One I thought I'd pick on first was that you have an interest in urban planning, and I'm just wondering what caught your interest about planning in Sydney and the area.
Well, sort of for me, how it sort of started was when I was in year 5. I was at a special needs school. And there was sort of not too much else for me at the time. So I'd spend most of my time on the school computer, sort of in the corner of the classroom. And what I used to do was that I would go and research different communities around Sydney, New South Wales, around the country, and I'd start drawing these train lines on the computer. And I'd start to, when I get back home, I'd go onto YouTube, go onto these different YouTube channels and find more about how we can sort of improve communities around new transport projects. And so it sort of grew out from there.
And of course, the thing that's changing is that well, Sydney's been evolving for decades, perhaps 100 years or so, but it's really changing a lot at the moment. I've been following, for instance, the Western Sydney Airport project. Do you think that's going to change the center of gravity of the city?
I think it will, eventually, along the track. I think it will, it will start to change things, once it opens up in 2026. We'll start, it's already been starting to happen already. A lot of companies and a lot of companies and a lot of government services like the ABC have moved their studios over to Parramatta for an example. So there's already quite a lot of momentum out, jobs going out west, and and that will probably keep going even further once the airport opens.
Yeah, and train wise, I noticed that you were excited, but amongst many excited people about the extension of the metro, and a nice early start for you on the service. What difference do you think that line has made? And now it's been open for a few months now. Everybody had expectations of what it was going to be. Do you think it's lived up to it?
I think it's from when I was chatting to a lot of the executives over at MTS, the patronage has been was well and truly underestimated. It has been incredibly popular since since day one. On a personal level, it saves me about 10 to 15 minutes every day going into the city, being Australia's first fully accessible and autonomous railway. That's helped out a lot with that. No gaps or steps between the train and the platform. Very frequent services every 4 minutes. But I think it's and I was having a chat with some people just earlier today. How much patronage there's been. We get about 1 million people. About 1 million people every week or two. So it's been way more than most of the people at the Sydney Metro already were thinking. They're probably going to need to start fast tracking stuff like 8 carriage services and 2-minute frequencies, just of how many people are using it.
And of course, one of the big differences that certainly struck me from all the videos you took and some of your friends have taken is how large the stations are. Are they as big as they look?
They are. There were quite a few when I, because I was lucky enough to be able to attend a lot of the community open days that they had, and a lot of there were some, I remember at Victoria Cross Metro, when we went down the lifts and then we came out of the tunnels of the northern entrance and we saw the platforms, and you can still see it on the video that I made, and that was genuinely the first time that I saw it, and I was just amazed at how huge it was. The platforms were so huge, and you had like the big cavern in there, so much more larger compared to what we had originally with with the city circle platforms, that were built back in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah. And you've already mentioned it, I think, but one thing you're particularly interested in is you're a disability advocate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think a lot of disabilities are like hidden? One thing I read recently was about a scheme in Melbourne where they've trained a very large group of people who they wander the transport system, whether it be trains or buses, and they just make themselves known as people that are very approachable to help anybody who wants help. Is there a similar move or similar options in Sydney?
I know that a lot of disabilities are are considered hidden disabilities. Like, for an example, myself, if you just went and saw me, you wouldn't know that that I had a hidden disability, unless if something went wrong, compared to a more visible disability, like being which normally is having some kind of accessory with you, like a wheelchair, or a walker or something like that, or cane, but, sort of in Sydney, it's been, it's a little bit mixed. We've had for, over the past 2 years, things have been getting slightly better. Not at the pace of some other places, like like we don't have from what I'm we haven't had that kind of system over Melbourne. I know that there's been an e-training module that all the Sydney train staff have been doing lately. I don't know how effective that's been so far, but so there's been a few small baby steps, especially with the metro. The metro's been a complete world of difference. It's being the staff of are lovely on board, and and we have and there's, a lot better amenities and facilities available as well. So that helps out a lot as well.
And of course, one thing that's been changing, which has also been happening in the UK, is a lot more stations now are being modified to be accessible as well. Do you think that has been a successful program? How many how many are and how many haven't, do you think?
Yeah, so I know that we had a big, station accessibility blitz, as I call it, over the past over the past 5-10 years or so, and we're sort of at the tail end of of that now. So we had the transport access program that brought lift brought lifts to nearly every single station, on the Sydney trains and intercity train network, and most regional stations as well. So nearly every station across New South Wales now has accessibility down to the platforms. Now there's only a few small spots here and there. Lewisham isn't accessible yet. Mount Ku-ring-gai isn't accessible yet. And Leightonfield, Villawood, Carramar. The local MP around Villawood and Carramar has been doing a lot of work, advocating to the state government to help to make it more accessible. Lewisham now has a plan to get that done. Same with McDonaldtown. McDonaldtown hasn't been accessible. Now it's going to be. So we're sort of at the tail end of that. And it's been a lot better. I remember because I used to go to a school up in Wahroonga, and whenever we would go on excursions and stuff like that, it was very difficult to do it by public transport, because normally we have at least 1 or 2 people in our class in a wheelchair, and it was just impossible. So they'd have to get driven down to Turramurra, which was the nearest station that had a lift. Since the Wahroonga was one of the stations that had a lift installed as a part of the transport access program. Now it's easy to for that school and the classes now to be able to access the stations.
So the city generally then is getting more accessible then, would you say?
Yeah, it's it's been quite a long a long process, and there's still quite a few things that I would like to see get done. Like there's we still with the trains, we still have a big issue with level access boarding. A lot of the platforms haven't been raised up. You don't see on some of the London underground platforms, or to have a part of a platform up to the train height. We haven't done that here yet. Even though that the trains are pretty similar. The different trains on the suburban network is different for the intercity lines, but the suburban lines, most of the trains are at similar heights and have been since the Red Rattler days.
Yeah. And I also see you're interested in transport in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that transport is becoming more sustainable?
Sort of more environmentally sustainable.
Yeah, yeah.
So we've had lately, Sydney Trains has just become 100% renewable, with their generating their electricity. So all the overhead lines, they're all now done by renewable energy, which is great. They're one of the first places in the country to do that, because we're still as a country quite far behind in in renewable energy. We make a lot of solar and and wind products, but we always export them. We never have we've been exporting them for decades, but we've never had any for ourselves. So it's good to see that started up as as well. We're also getting some new bimodal trains for out in the regions as well. So we're going to get them out in about a year or two. They've just started testing just a few days ago, actually.
Right. So have you seen any yet?
No, I haven't. It's been at about 10 o'clock at night, and I haven't been, just haven't had a chance to yet. But they've been doing, a few runs around Denniston, Epping, around there. So yeah, and they've been doing, so they'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, they will. Well,
Mhm.
it's a constantly evolving picture, isn't it?
Mm.
Because there must be a lot of train assets in the city. It can't be an easy job deciding which of the old ones get the chop and which ones
Yeah.
get replaced.
Mm.
So, in terms of history, you seem to have an interest in history. So,
Yeah.
how where how important is history, do you think, in informing not only where we've come from, but where we think we're going to be going?
I think it's critical, even, just in transport, seeing, the progress that's been made, and, the amount of, even, with our heritage transport, the amount of engagement and, enthusiasm with that. I think it's vital to, maintain that connection, to maintain that connection, with our history. We have a lot of history in this country, both our European history, going back, going back, over 220 years. And then also, we have a lot of, First Nations, heritage as well, going back, over 65,000 years, now. So, so it's very important to be able to, maintain that.
Mm. And I see that trams is kind of on your uh,
Mm.
radar, and you might
Yeah.
even be a volunteer at a local tram
Yeah.
museum,
So,
right?
yeah, so I'm a member down at the at the Tramway Museum. I'm hoping to be able to start volunteering soon. Just depends on health stuff and all of that. Got to be as fit as a fiddle to be able to be a conductor. Standing up on on the wooden boards. The running boards and all that. You know got to be able to maintain all of that for an entire day. um but but it's the trams, Sydney trams, was amazing. What we had the second largest tramway network in the British Commonwealth. Number one being London. Yeah, it was London number one. So we had trams going down to La Perouse, out to Bondi Beach, out to Ryde, out to Manly, and Narrabeen, down to Earlwood. We had trams everywhere, and we had thousands of trams running at any one time across the network. And they'd handle all kinds of traffic, people coming from the railways, people coming from the ships. We'd have people going to the zoo, going to the Easter show, going to the footy, going to the races, going to school, going to the local shops, going to work. They all did it, by tram. And we had a huge, highly efficient and very successful network. But after the Second World War, like a lot of other Western European cities, Western cities did, in the US and Europe and in other places in Australia and New Zealand. We went and cut our network all up, and it was all gone by 1961. And I still believe, it's one of the biggest mistakes we ever made with our, planning, in Sydney. We've started now with, we've had the Dulwich Hill line open up in different stages between 1997 and 2014. 2019 we had the George Street trams open down the Kingsford and Randwick, but we still have, you know, a lot more to go to be able to, you know, achieve, you know, how, how successful, you know, the trams were, you know, back then, because, you know, because for decades, the car and bus network in, you know, in the inner parts of Sydney just haven't been able to, you know, they just don't cope with, you know, with the traffic, with the foot traffic, which, you know, the trams were able to do, you know, pretty well.
And what's interesting looking at old maps, particularly tram maps, is that they went to places that perhaps the modern trams could never go. Would you agree with?
Yeah, you know, there's, you know, there are some, you know, they had some, you know, they had some, you know, they had all kinds of places that they used to go to, some of the, some of the modern articulated trams may have, might have some difficulties, like Watson's Bay, that was, used to go through this reserve right next to the cliffs and, and the coast. And it was, it was basically a whole railway design. And it was, very similar on the approach to Bondi Beach and Bronny Beach, and Balmoral as well, Balmoral Beach, very similar railway style systems that they had to set up.
And of course, before the Harbour Bridge, a few lines used to go and meet the ferries, didn't they?
Yeah, and and the railway line as well. So before, my local line, the North Shore line, and you can still see this for yourself. If you look out to your right on the way from between Waverton and North Sydney, you'll see this line diverge out, this one track line that just diverges out. That was the original, main line, went down to the original Wilson's Point station, which is now Luna Park down in Sydney, Milson's Point, and it connected with the trams, with the trams and the ferries. It was this whole, tram train ferry interchange at Milson's Point. And they used to have these huge ferries, they were, they could fit about 2,000 people, take them, straight down to Circular Quay. It was, and they used to, keep going from dawn all the way, into dusk and out to midnight. It was, they, probably wouldn't be able to do it now, with the amount of people now, but it was amazing how they were able to, set it all up.
It must have been an amazing sight to see 2,000 going on and off like that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting looking at old trams, because the thing that always amazes me is how small they were, and they didn't go very fast.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think people used to use trams?
Well, it was sort of, before, cars were, were available for people. So, for most people, it was, so most communities, around the eastern suburbs, lower North Shore and the inner west, were all built, around trams. You can, recognize a lot of them now being, slightly more higher dense areas, and you get all these random little corner shops, like around Military Road, Oxford Street, Bondi Road, Victoria Road, Parramatta Road, etc. You'd see, these little, whole, these shop top housing and all that along there. So these communities, grew up, around, around the trams, and it was a vital part of the community. And then when the cars took over, and which was encouraged by the government at the time, trams, patronage slowly died out. But they were able to be quite efficient. You can still see like old videos. They used to have like for the races at the race course in Randwick, what they would do is that, they had this, six platform, tram termini, and they just have, and they'd just have the trams just slow, they'd all be bunched up together, but they would slowly move like, like a moving walkway. And, and people just go down these huge ramps down to the platforms to just jump on the first, the first tram that they could get, and they'd all go to Central. So they'd just jump on and they'd all go. And they were able to, they were able to carry thousands of people every few minutes, those services. They were able to clear out, crowds quite quickly with that kind of, service.
It's amazing, actually. I mean, you mentioned about looking at the old movie clips. They never seemed to move very fast, but there was there always seemed to be lots of people using them. And I often wondered, why I asked you about why they'd use them, because they didn't go very fast. I wonder whether it was like an early version of social media, because you could probably walk or cycle faster than some of the trams actually traveled at. I wonder whether it was more like a meeting place.
Well, it was sort of, with with the trams, back then, again, there wasn't as many cars on the road, so they could, pick up a little bit more of a pace. But what you can do, trams are still quite popular in Melbourne, especially, in the city, because, you just hop on, you take a seat, and, you just hop on, you take a seat. You don't need to do anything. You can, read a newspaper. You can, you can read a newspaper nowadays. You can listen to some music, and or stuff like that. And the tram just takes you wherever you want to go. Down the street, into the city, and then once you're done, you're there. So so it was better. A lot better than some of the alternatives back then, and even and a lot of the alternatives even now.
And they're becoming very popular again, aren't they?
Yeah.
How do you see? You recently went to have another early morning in Parramatta to welcome in. Was it line number 4? And they've already got one. Yeah. There's already another one going to be happening on the back of that. So how do you think the network's going to develop?
Well, it sort of depends on how much the state government's wanting to invest in it at the moment. From what I'm aware of, there's quite a bit of a break in new tram and metro lines being announced at the moment for for financial reasons, because City and Southwest and the Metro and the Western Metro have costed quite a lot. So there's been a bit of a break in that, but hopefully we'll see soon trams going down Parramatta Road. Parramatta Road's a very neglected part of the city. It goes past, it goes from Central, goes through the University of Sydney, and then it continues out towards, Burwood, and then, Olympic Park, and then out to Parramatta. It's been a very neglected part of, of the city, because it's been, very over-reliant on cars. There's old, abandoned, you get these abandoned corner shops, closer into the city, like around Camperdown. And then once you sort of get out, towards Parramatta, you get all these abandoned car dealerships. So, having a tram line along there could, just like, how they did, over 100 years ago, rejuvenate, rejuvenate communities.
Yeah. Do you think there's a particular attraction about trams over buses, or is it just you either like trains or trams or buses? Is there a particular love for trams that makes them interesting to use?
I better be careful. I don't want to get banned from any bus tours. From this, we saw that podcast. You're banned. No more Fire Museum at Penrith for you. Anyways, but but I think that there's I think with modern trams, the increased capacity, there's it's there's a more it's for people it's a more clearer, more simplified kind of system. Like I know it's not I know it's not simple to set up, but but for just like like a train line or a metro line, compared to a bus where where there's all kinds of different routes, and people start to get confused. Do I go and take the 207, or do I take the 194? I had someone just today got all confused with the bus routes, got snappy with the bus driver because of that, even though it wasn't the bus driver's fault, and stuff like that. But but with the trams, where you're going, pretty much where the tram is, the tram is going, and it's easier to have clear, simple, information for people, with that, and it's easier for people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah. So when it comes to the modern stuff, obviously health and safety is something that gets thought about a lot.
Mm.
Do you think we've gone too far in the opposite direction? Because obviously the old trams were very unsafe. They had no windows, no door. You could just get off. They were very dangerous.
No, definitely not advocating, to bring bring the old type trams, bring the old toast rack trams, back into service again. The kids are gonna love that for sure. Definitely not that. I think we're at pretty, again, it can, it sort of depends on the public, the public mood and opinion, and it'll change over time, once again, just like with any other form of transport, once we get something newer and safer, we're gonna go, oh, the old's unsafe. But I think at the moment, it's pretty appropriate. We got at the moment our trains at the moment, we don't have any trains that with manual doors. You can just open them up and hope for the best. So we're pretty all right at the moment.
What I thought was interesting, a few people commented on just before the Parramatta line opened that there were markings on the pavements, sidewalks,
Right.
warning people to move away from their phones, so that they would notice a tram before they got run over. Do you think? Do you see many people on phones making the mistake of not where they are?
Yes, if you're going down George Street and on a tram and you get up to the front, you're almost guaranteed to see someone go whoop, straight through there, and and then they have to blast the horn, not the bell, that kind of, in that kind of situation, they need some special treatment with the horn, boom, and having to put on the brakes and stuff like that. You're pretty much guaranteed to have that multiple times, in a service. So so the signs were, and it's especially, it's especially more common, when a service is just starting up. So having that there for a few months or so during the testing process and the initial first phases of operation, are important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I noticed recently you had a little walk round. Was it the powerhouse building? And in there you spotted an old monorail carriage, which is funny because I actually on my first visit to Australia many years ago, when I first saw it, I thought, oh my goodness, Sydney's such a modern city. It's got these sleek things on high, and it goes in a building and comes out the other side. they were pretty basic inside, but they were very good for a tour of the CBD. But they've not really taken off as a concept. Do you think that was not unexpected?
No, it's, when I was, 5, when I was 6, when it closed down, I was monorail fan number 1 because, as a little kid, I used to go on there all the time. It was, I loved it, even more. I loved it even more than the trains. But in retrospect, a lot of the criticisms, it was criticized from day one. A big issue was that it only went around in one direction, and just in the CBD. It didn't go out into didn't connect people from the suburbs, didn't anything like that. And and there were other alternatives, like a tram line. The original idea of the tram line through Darling Harbour, which would have actually got across the Piedmont Bridge, would have been more viable alternatives for for transport to Darling Harbour than the monorail was. Even though how much 6-year-old me would kill me at this point. but that's so a lot of the criticisms were quite valid. And it was it was a great thing to as a tourist, or as a little kid, to hop on and go about with. But a lot of commuters, and and the people living around it, who could have benefited from it, didn't really help them out as much as they could. And it was quite expensive as well. So after 25 years, they just went and bought out the monorail company, which also owned which also owned the light rail as well. So that meant the government could extend the tram line from Lilyfield to Dulwich Hill, and also start that George Street tram as well. But but they also controlled the monorail, so they could just just take it out.
Yeah.
And and now the trams are is the main way of going around Darling Harbour. And there's also the Metro West, which will go to Piedmont as well, so that'll be good.
Yeah. When it comes to mass transit, one of the things I first noticed on my first visit to Sydney was double-decker trains. And I thought it was, well, not seeing many of those in the UK. I thought they were very, very exciting to go on. And there's always been a lot of them. But it's interesting how the ideas either catch on or they don't, because if you see some of the heritage train sets in Sydney, there weren't many double-decker carriages early on. It was almost as if the people who made them weren't 100% sure that people would like them. But now you have a lot of double-decker trains. But if you look at somewhere like Melbourne, they also tried it. But they had a few problems. I don't know if it was the weight of the carriages, or they were using a different voltage for the train sets. But I even heard that the reason that they finally knocked it on the head was that there were too many low bridges. And I was thinking, well, don't they have low bridges in Sydney as well? What happened there?
Yeah. But in Sydney, our underground railway, was always designed for double-decker trains. That was always, that was what Dr. Bradfield, who helped to, who went and built the city circle, the hub, and the harbour bridge, and he had this huge master plan, transport network. He initially proposed, he went and proposed the eastern suburbs line, and there would have been about an additional 3-4 underground railway lines, um, in the CBD compared to the existing suburban network. So it was always, his plan, for was with the tunnels was to have them, double decked by the time that they were built. But initially they were sort of thinking more of like a, New York City style, subway system. So we're talking like in the 1910s, before the 20s and the 30s, sort of brought on, the double decker train. So you have like, so so initially, they were single decker trains, and and they just didn't bother to, they just didn't really build any double decker trains until the 1960s. But you could see, a lot of the, like the Bradfield stock were, heavily inspired by, stuff in, in America. They had like, 3-4 single, single, doors, across like that. And it was, a much different design compared to, what Sydney had in the end. But, it was always designed to, be double decker, and stuff like that. And, and we sort of just embraced it, and, and it, it worked. In Melbourne, they could only run, the train that they had was the 4D, double decker development and demonstration train, which, was heavily based off the Tangara here in Sydney. They could only run on 2 lines, because the other lines, there just wasn't enough room for for the double decker trains. The trains themselves, because they had because they had they had the same body and design as the Tangaras, but they had different internal motors and systems, to the to the Tangara. So it was it was heavily prone to breakdowns, and it just and it was not reliable. It could only run on two lines. So it gave double decker trains a bad name in Melbourne. So all the carriages were scrapped by around 2006. And by that time Melburnians just went, nah, it's there's always been a rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, for for a long time. But that just was all the breakdowns and unreliabilities and the limits in operation just gave them a bad name in the end.
Yeah. Well, but Sydney stuck with them, and it's worked really well.
Yeah, it's worked pretty well.
So one thing that that's happened to you recently is that you won an award, didn't you?
Yeah.
For so tell me what being a young citizen of the year means to you.
Yeah. So I had, so in January I had this call from, from the council saying, hey, you've been nominated. And then 5 seconds later they called back and said, oh, by the way, you've won. You've won this Young Citizen of the Year award. Someone in the community nominated you. And, and I went, yay, lovely, so sat to, I was, about to pack up to go to New Zealand, sat to cut that short by a couple of days to be here, for Australia Day, which, for the 26th of January, which was, when we were going to have the ceremony, sort of have all the, get my award. And then we had about 250 or so new Aussie citizens we had on, on the day as well. They got to become new citizens as well. So it's great to share that day with them. But it was such a huge honor and privilege to be able to, get that award. It's, a lot of work and a lot of effort, over the years. Probably the doctors who gave me, my first prognosis when I was first diagnosed on the spectrum, would probably be screaming, going, we made the wrong prognosis big time, with that. So, it was, such a huge honor and privilege to be able to, get such an award. I'll never forget it. Never forget it.
Yeah, I'm sure you won't. And I must assume then that you feel a great deal of pride in being Australian then.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. People get weirded out when they hear this accent. A little bit British. But it's such, it's such a huge, I've been here in Sydney my entire life, been here in Australia pretty much my entire life, except when I was 1, I was gone for like 6 months, but I was a baby, so I don't even remember it. But, but I love Sydney, I love Australia, no matter how far or wide I go, this is the place that I'm going to call home.
Yeah. So do you have an interest maybe in some kind of public service in the future?
I've been doing a lot of, work advocating, for my community, especially, for people with a hidden disability. Did a lot of work in youth parliament. So I got to go into New South Wales Parliament, got to write legislation to help protect people with a disability in the education system, which was wonderful. It was an amazing bill, and it was such a moving experience for me, that and I've been doing some work with Ku-ring-gai Council. I'm in their youth advisory committee, so I advise the council on issues relating to young people in Ku-ring-gai. Do a lot of work advocating to politicians around around election time. We're about to start a federal election in a few weeks' time, so doing a lot of work on that. And we also have and we had the state election in 2023 and the local election in 2024. A lot of advocacy work on that, listening to people in my community, and and help to advocate them to decision makers. So it's definitely something that I am considering, doing that sometime in the future.
Well, I will watch this space and see what mark you have on city. I will rest. Maybe it will yeah. No, I look forward to see what you do. So one thing that always seems to come up from time to time is whether Australia will jump in and go for high-speed rail. Now, do you think this is a real project, or is it just a dream?
Well, in my own personal opinion, I think Sydney needs high, I think Australia needs high speed rail on the, on the East Coast. It's, we still, are on the same network that we had 150 years ago. Our other transport networks, road and air, have developed so much since then. But the rail network hasn't developed. And and along the East Coast between Brisbane, Sydney, and Canberra, and Melbourne, we have there's a lot of we have the capital cities and also a lot of regional towns as well, who could which are well within the zone where high speed rail or even faster intercity rail travel, so maximum 200 kilometers per hour, similar to, a lot of, LNER services, in the UK, would be viable for like Sydney to Canberra and stuff like that. Even that cheaper, developments like that. But I think, longer term, high speed rail is definitely, definitely something that we will look into. There's a lot of, but a big issue is that there's a lot of things, going, going against it at the moment. It can be very easily just a change of government, that can just cause the funding to cut off, and and there's cost, and also the time that it will take to build and stuff like that. So, I think so a lot of people here think that it just won't happen. It will just be impossible. So I think, before considering high speed rail, we should be considering upgrading existing infrastructure to provide, more efficient and more reliable services. Like Sydney to Canberra at the moment, um, it's about 250 kilometers between the two cities. So well within the zone where where rail travel is viable. It's in perfect zone for that. Um, but it takes an hour to fly, and that's excluding, traveling to the airport, going through the terminals and security and stuff like that. But the average price for that is, is about $400 just for that 1 hour flight one way. Driving is about three hours, so is the coach. And then the train is 4 hours. It's 4 hours to go 250 kilometers between Sydney and Canberra, and there's only 3 services a day. It is cheaper. It's about $40-50 for an adult ticket, but it's but for most people, they just drive. Or they fly, because it just takes too long. But even then, these tiny 3-carriage trains, most people just drive and fly. But even then, those small 3 trains a day, get booked out days in advance, before they go. So, there's definitely a lot of demand, and if we can cut down the service to, under 3 hours, so, preferably, if we can cut it to under 3 hours, which, a train going at a maximum of 200 kilometers per hour, 125 miles per hour, would be able to, do that brilliantly. And, and if we, still have it at around, similar price, to that, and increase the frequency to, say, every hour, I think that, we would see way more people going between the two. And there's also, a lot of towns along the way. We have, Western Sydney. We also have the Southern Highlands as well, Bowral, Moss Vale. We also have Goulburn as well, before heading down to Canberra. So, so I think if we, I think that if we, did some of those more simpler projects, which, to be able to get the line down to Canberra, if we get a new station closer to the CBD for, for Canberra, and we do those curve easing, we get the electrification done, and we get, new trains going maximum 200 kilometers per hour that have the capacity. I think, even just those simple changes, would make, would be a huge success. And then, people can start, thinking more realistically of, of high speed rail down to Melbourne up to Brisbane.
Well, it sounds like you've thought about it a lot, and maybe it'd be something you will advocate locally.
Yeah, it's it's one of the things that I do talk about. and and also as well, sleeper, one of the things that I have talking with I have had a little chat with the regional transport minister who I know, Jenny Atkinson. I've had a chat with her about, maintaining the sleeper services down to Melbourne and up to Brisbane as well. That's another way as well we can get, get, high speed rail to be more viable, is to, because at the moment there's one sleeper train a night to Melbourne, leaves at about 8:40 p.m, gets to Melbourne for 7:30 a.m. It's only one carriage is actually a sleeper. It's a twinette, and the rest are all seaters, which isn't nice. But but the twinettes are incredibly popular. They get sold out more than a month before, about a month or two before, before the date of travel. But there's no, we don't have any single suites, or or late, or any other variety of, of services. And definitely, and I think, if we, when we do this, if we get, because the XPTs are life expired, they're, built around similar design and built around the same time as the HSTs, so, they're completely life expired, and so are the carriages. But one of the big downsides of the new regional trains is that, they're DMUs, and they also have no sleeping compartments. So, so it's going to be very difficult to be able to, have a overnight sleeper service be viable. There's definitely demand for it, but if you don't provide, the amenities and facilities, then there's going to be no demand, because nobody's going to want to use it. So, if we had, I've been doing a lot of research with a lot of, European sleeper trains, and if we could, get, get a few of them, running down to Melbourne, I think they would be, quite popular. And Brisbane as well. Brisbane, big issue is that, the sleeper train leaves Sydney at around 2 p.m. and gets to Brisbane for just before 5 a.m. in the morning. And you have to get, and they remove you immediately, because then, they have the return day service back to Sydney immediately afterwards, which leaves at about 5:30 in the morning. For that, it's because of restrictions with Queensland Rail around Brisbane. But if there is cooperation between New South Wales Trainlink and QR, and change the timetable around that, I think the sleepers to Brisbane would be more popular.
Yeah. Well, you can see why people prefer to fly
Yeah,
in between Sydney and Melbourne.
yeah.
I read once that route is in the top 5 on the planet in terms
Yeah.
of uh, the number of people who use it.
It's the second. Sydney to Melbourne is the second most popular route, in the world. And Brisbane's not that far behind. And also same with travel to other capital cities, including Adelaide. Adelaide's sort of at like the edge of, of what, of at the very edge of a viable, rail service. But Brisbane, I think, is in the top. Sydney to Brisbane's in the top 20, I think it is. And then Sydney to Melbourne's number 2.
Now, in terms of Sydney itself, now as a visitor, everybody goes to the bridge and the harbour, to see the Opera House. But there must be a lot of places people miss out completely. People like to use the phrase "hidden gems." Would you say there's a lot of places people forget to go to?
Plenty. The harbour's is an amazing place to, to go to. One of the most beautiful places on earth. But there's a lot of, plenty of hidden gems, all across Sydney and beyond.
Well, I was thinking, I saw a guy try to to do all the boat trips around the Sydney CBD in a single day. He didn't quite make it, but he seemed to get a lot of sunburn, and I think he managed
there for a long time.
he managed. I think he managed it by missing 2 stops, but it seemed a very. Do you think going by boat in Sydney is underutilized? Is it one of those modes of transport that gets overlooked?
Well, I think it's the Manly Ferry service, the Taronga Zoo service, and the Parramatta River service is very popular with tourists. Normally get about 1 million people. So in peak season during the summer, we're about to creep over to 2 million now, first time in about 75 years with that. But it's been, after pretty much after the bridge opened up in the 1930s, there was quite a significant amount of neglect with the ferry networks, which still can be seen to this day. And by the 60s, the ferry services, except for the Manly service, were nearly extinct. They nearly went the way of the trams, actually. But then there was some timely investment. There was with the lady class ferries, and then the first fleet class ferries, which are very popular, world icons in themselves. And then the new and then the freshwater ferries, for Sydney ferries, and then the river cats as well, extending the services out to Parramatta, were quite popular. There was, and then lately there were, quite a few, in my own opinion, poor judgments made with some of the ferry, with some of the ferry purchases to replace those ferries. Like there were the Gen 2 Emerald ferries that were, which are currently running between Circular Quay and Manly. They break down nearly every other day. There's been quite a few instances where the engines blow up, the steering fails, they don't cope in the swells across the Manly heads, and they're replacing ferries which can seat over 1,000 passengers, and during peak season normally get full, even with 4 of those running at a time. With services running every 15 minutes. They still get full. They're basically like they're basically like a whole double-decker train, on the water. Their whole train along the water, but they replace them with ferries that can only fit in 400 people with that. So that was pretty tough. And then the river class ferries as well, they had an upper deck on them, to go out to Parramatta, but they didn't realize until it was too late, is that if you stood up, on there, so if you stood up on the seats on there, and you go and you go under the bridges, which there's quite a few low ones, just before you get to Parramatta, your head would get chopped off. If you stood up on the seats, your head would get chopped off. So they went and built them, and then they tested them, and they went, oh. So that caused quite a bit, a big mess. They bought them overseas, built them, then bought them over here, and they went, I wouldn't want to be that person up there,
No,
I think they might have had a bit of a bad day, but now there's the new Parramatta class ferries. They've been built. They were built over in Hobart. There is an issue with them, not having access out to the bow, but they're okay. They're okay. They don't have any defects or anything like that, which is good. and then there's also plans soon for for new ferries of a similar size to they'll be slightly smaller, but not as small as the Emeralds. They'll be able to fit in like probably about 700-800 people on them to replace the Manly ferries, and they're going to be either electric or hydrogen power. They're currently setting up the plans for that at the moment. And in the meantime, they brought back the old freshwater ferries to be able to, handle, it's, for days where where there's higher seas or there's, more people, than usual. They're still available. So, that was after a lot of campaigning by locals in the northern beaches and also by ferry enthusiasts as well, both locals and ferry enthusiasts, coming together to save the Manly ferry. And there's also been, over the past few months, there's been some investments in new wharves. There's Balmain West Wharf opening up soon. There's been wharves open up in La Perouse and Cornell, although that they're not starting up a public ferry service there. They've set up a new F10 service between Barangaroo and Blackwattle Bay. And then there's going to be a Circular Quay to fish market service opening up soon when the new fish market opens up at the end of the year.
Yeah, so exciting changes coming up. And in terms of the future, of course, there's not only been some, major recent changes like the central station totally. I mean, that's a total underground transformation. But there's also thoughts of redeveloping Circular Quay, isn't there? So what do you think of, future projects coming up and whether some will go ahead or not?
Yeah, so Central, that's been a huge transformation. Especially Central Walk. It's really opened up the station a lot more. New entrances and new connections. It's not as overcrowded and stuffy as it used to be. During the peak, and not as creepy and disturbing at night. Along some of the old tunnels. They used to have these old tunnels that would only go to like some of the platforms, but not all of them, and they were like these these tiny ones, and that were like 100 years old. So it's a lot better now. And Circular Quay, it's overdue for redevelopment there. And the Cahill Expressway is such a neglected part of the city. It'd be great to see that, to see the expressway pedestrianized sometime soon.
Yeah, well, I mean, the project I've heard was that the plan to bury both the highway and the Circular Quay railway station and put them underground. That's quite an ambitious project and would totally change the landscape of Circular Quay, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it'd bring it back to basically how it was back before the expressway and the train line was built back in the 50s. I don't know if they'll be able to go that far, but it'd be great to if they can pedestrianize the Cahill Expressway, the road up on the top there. It's such an underutilized part of the city, and you have the cars whizzing through there, but every now and then, and I say every now and then because there's the Harbour Tunnel and the Western Harbour Tunnel that's opening up soon as well. So there's not a lot of traffic on there anymore. But it's in such a beautiful place, and be great to if it was pedestrianized, it could be great for like markets and and festivals and stuff like that. It would be amazing to have that all. To have that prime harbourfront area to be open to the public.
Yeah, well, I remember the headland of Barangaroo before they really got going, and I was really impressed by the fact that a park had been created, in the middle of the city, and I thought, what a wonderful idea. So, do you have like hopes for the future of the city and the place that you've grown up? What would you like
Well,
to?
there's a lot of challenges, at the moment. We're currently in a huge housing crisis at the moment. It's very difficult for people to be able to, afford places to live here in Sydney. If you go out to Western Sydney, there's a big issue with the urban heat island effect by some of, the new, low density, developments built around Marsden Park and stuff like that. You can get temperatures in the 40s, sometimes even up to the 50s, 50 degrees Celsius there. So, it's, very difficult, out there. So, we need to, at the moment, definitely consider, building more houses, more development, around public transport, and build shops and community services around public transport, existing and new public transport services, because that's going to be the only way that we're going to be able to, allow the city to be able to, to continue to thrive, is to not be as over reliant on, on cars and, and have stuff near public transport in existing land.
And I guess is that what's being envisaged for the area around Western Sydney Airport? There's a new town going up, isn't there?
Yeah, Luddenham. And there's also been over the past few months, the state government's has announced transit oriented development, proposals, around existing train and metro stations, around Sydney, including, near where I'm, low, and there's also the low mid-rise housing policy, 171 train stations in local town centres. They're going to, allow for, terraces, townhouses, around train stations and, in town centres. So, we should be seeing a lot more supply, because there's not enough supply at the moment, and we've seen house prices go up sky high. Like for me, I probably won't be able, because to try and buy a one bedroom apartment here, near where I am, costs $500,000. At the moment, so it's just unrealistic. It's unrealistic that I'm going to be able to, afford either large flat unit if I had a family in the future, or buy a house, for my family in the future. And I probably, would need to stay, at home for, for years to come, which just isn't practical, at the moment. And, and you also get a lot of people who are concerned about, about the new developments, that are happening around, people, not wanting, their streets, destroyed, their character, the character of their communities. And I can get that, because I can understand, where people, who are concerned about these things are coming from. Where I'm at the moment is inside of the low mid-rise housing policy. So my childhood home, is going to get demolished by this. But at the moment, with, with how things, with, the urgency of what's happening at the moment, we desperately don't have, we don't have enough supply, and we have a lot of demand, and we can't cut off the demand. We have, a lot of young people, a lot of them, they're not just going from overseas, moving in here. A lot of them, were born here, and they're just trying to find somewhere independent to live. And, but at the moment, there just isn't anywhere. So, even if that means that, that my house goes, and, we have to change, the community have to change my community, that's just what we, that's just what we need to do to, to help our community so we can keep it thriving for years to come.
And let's hope that it does, and I'm sure you'll wish to be a big part of it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to thank you very much for joining me today. I could easily chat to you about travel and transport for a long time. So
thank you so much. Thank you, Alex. I'd love to be back on again, anytime, anytime. Love to hear more from you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. And yeah, we'll stay in touch, and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone.